And because we're a small group, feel free to jump in with questions as I'm talking. So that will work pretty well. So again, this is another project in the city of Vancouver. We are pretty well connected with this group because our founder of Happy Cities, Charles Montgomery, is actually a resident here. So it's been really interesting to actually learn about the co-housing process firsthand. And it's, again, a co-housing community. So if you're not familiar with what co-housing is, it's really a group of citizens who came together and acted as the developers for their own home. So it's a pretty interesting model. Very few co-housing projects in Canada. I think BC is actually the province that has the most of them. But, you know, there's just really a handful of communities that have emerged over the last few years. And these kind of urban co-housing communities are quite new. So again, in Europe, they're quite prevalent. In Canada, their co-housing was mostly kind of rural in like more areas where, you know, there's more land and cheaper land. We now have kind of 5 urban co-housing communities in Vancouver. So it's been really interesting to see how they're emerging. So this is a 6-story building completed in 2021. So they have 25 homes. And if you're familiar with co-housing, you'll know that the kind of recommended group size is between 25 and 35 homes. So really those numbers come from experience with co-housing communities in Europe and understanding where the kind of critical mass is, because they kind of self-manage the process and the building. There needs to be kind of enough families to be able to kind of not feel too overburdened with kind of all of these tasks. But as the communities get too large, it becomes really, really hard to self-manage because they kind of operate by consensus. You can imagine that when there are, you know, more than 25 households, it gets to be pretty crazy. So if you're, you know, having a meeting with consensus with 50 people, that's quite a few people to kind of manage. They only have 19 parking spaces, so that I think is a really interesting, and I'll talk about some of these things. 35 bicycle spaces, FSR of 2.8 without exclusions, and 2.3 with the exclusions. So some of the exclusions that they got were parking areas, and then amenity areas. Also an exclusion for passive house wall thickness because it is a passive house certified building, and some of the service spaces, including the HRV. So big design team, obviously, you know, it is a resident-led development, but they're not architects and engineers, so they still have to hire kind of the architects and engineers to actually do the project. They also worked with Renee Matthew, who is a pretty well-known kind of co-housing development management consultant. So they did need to kind of bring in a little bit of help to actually manage this process. So some of the key features you'll see on the floor plan. It's kind of an interesting floor plate. So it's a pretty small footprint 6-story building with a little courtyard here. So they have kind of a lot of their main amenity spaces located in this ground floor. They've got their little lobby, which I'll show you photos of, which is pretty cool, but it serves as kind of like the connecting point for all the social spaces, including their common house, their little courtyard, their shared laundry room, this rumpus room, which is kind of like a flexible space that serves as both like kind of a children's play area, a yoga room, even a co-working space. And then they also have a rooftop deck, which I'll show you a picture of. So this is a little courtyard. They really wanted to have this idea of a little lawn where, you know, kids could play. So they kind of put this feature in. They also were able to get this kind of exterior circulation around the courtyard, so they have that kind of visual connection between the two spaces. And then their common house, which is really kind of the heart of co-housing. So this is where they do all of their shared meals. They do their, you know, they had a music talent show the other night. Those are photos from it. Interestingly, they had a lot of challenges with the acoustics in the building. So you'll see on the ceiling that they have like acoustic spray foam that was kind of added retroactively. So it is something definitely to think about with these kind of more sociable buildings. And it is like a common theme that we hear where when they have, when there are acoustic challenges between spaces, it can create a lot of conflicts between neighbors. The lobby is really interesting. So it is used as kind of like a common area as well. The kids really like to build pillow forts in the lobby, and it is allowed. So it's interesting to understand like how these co-housing communities use their spaces, which is pretty radically different from professionally managed rental buildings where you're not really allowed to play in the lobby or you're not allowed to leave stuff in the hallway. So thinking about how we can both design these types of spaces, but then the other piece that we do is try to do advocacy work to understand like, okay, how are we managing these buildings and how are we allowing people to use those spaces? And you can see this little lobby, it's not a big space, but it really acts as this kind of connecting point for all of the social spaces, which works really well to create this social atmosphere. The other really interesting feature in this building are these social nooks. So on each floor, kind of where the elevator comes out, there's doorways, and they've kind of eliminated this idea of like a long corridor, which you would usually have in a 6-story building. And they've created these really nice kind of social lobbies on each side, each area. So they all kind of have a different function. This particular one is a library. And you can see kind of the exterior hallway. They also have these like smaller scale, outdoor gathering spaces. And I think it's really interesting because often we'll have like a big amenity space in a 6-story building, but you won't have these kinds of like smaller social nodes. And those are really kind of crucial to the social fabric of the building. And then the parkade is kind of interesting because they are, a lot of the residents there ride cargo bikes. They don't really have a lot of cars. So they worked really hard with the city of Vancouver to get exemptions for the parking. They just really didn't want to build all those parking spots, and they were successful. So in kind of exchange for the space that they saved on parking spots, they were able to actually build this music room, which also now serves as like a video game space for some of the kids in the building. And then they also have a workshop. So, and, looking at creative solutions to store their canoes and things like that. The other interesting thing is that the parking stalls are not associated with a particular unit. So they're kind of decoupled, which allows them that kind of flexibility of use. And then finally, they have a rooftop garden where they have their main kind of growing space. And they also have a little common space, which is near here. So that one is kind of like a more of a flexible kind of movie room, co-working space. So kind of some of the key lessons that are interesting from this building. Really right now, co-housing requires committed residents and currently pretty deep pockets. So tell you a little bit about the work that we're trying to get started, which is looking at kind of the financial and legal barriers to making co-housing easier. 2, I'll talk a little bit about the permitting delays that happened in this project and how they directly impacted affordability. Some of the city policies that did enable some of the shared spaces. This importance of a mix of formal and informal common spaces. And then some of the social benefits that we've been seeing. So this mutual support that we do get in co-housing buildings is really reducing isolation and also daily expenses. And then finally, thinking about, how to make these types of projects easier will really require some pretty big changes. So kind of in terms of the project timeline, there was kind of 2 members who were part of a kind of a failed co-housing group. And that's pretty typical. I think only 70 to 80% of groups are actually successful in building a building. So their group had folded in 2014. These 2 members kind of came together and said, we still really want to do this. So they decided to hire this co-housing consultant with their own money to get this project going. They were actually able to recruit members pretty fast. So they had kind of what we call equity households that joined, and they kind of put in a little bit of money to kind of be part of the group. And then they kind of pause recruitment and start looking at securing land. So they had kind of acquired this property in 2016. So it was kind of a bunch of single family homes that they had to acquire from individual owners. And the land was already actually zoned in part of the neighborhood plan for 6 stories. So they didn't have a ton of work to do, though it still took a while to actually get their development permit, which was almost like 2 years from when they acquired the property. So because cohousing right now doesn't have its own legal structure in Canada, it is just basically a strata building. So basically the group formed a limited liability corporation that acted as a nonprofit developer. And that's kind of how they were able to get their kind of funding and financing. They actually worked with Van City for their mortgage. Van City tends to be the one people go to here in BC because they are kind of more open to these kind of innovative projects. Other banks kind of are like, I'm not really sure what to do with this group. They may see it as kind of high risk in terms of giving them a mortgage. And then they also got their construction loans from CMHC, so kind of through the same process that any developer would do. They were pretty lucky that a lot of their members had properties that they owned in Vancouver that they were kind of willing to sell and put more money towards the group. So, not everyone came with the same equity, and that's kind of acceptable in cohousing, where some of the members with deeper pockets will kind of help get the project going in the beginning. And they did want to include below market units, but they weren't actually able to do that because of the construction loan that they were able to get. There is another example in North Vancouver of Driftwood Village, and they actually have some below market units, and that was actually directly possible because of the City of North Vancouver's policy, where they reduced the development charges in exchange for those affordable units. So in terms of kind of the cost of this, interestingly, the project came kind of at market value despite having kind of the passive house, the amenity spaces. So because they were kind of involved early on in making these decisions, they were able to integrate all of these spaces pretty effectively. One thing that I did ask them about and that they would do differently is kind of streamline their process. So they actually had 13 different unit designs in the building, and that was kind of the piece that added some significant cost. So thinking about the permitting delays, so the development permit was delayed by at least 6 months. In the end, the city did not give a reason for why the delay happened. It was just because, like, there was no reason. And yeah, they kind of calculated that that delay cost added about $40,000 per unit. So pretty significant affordability impact. And the delay on this one was not that bad. Some of them have much worse delays in the city of Vancouver. But it is like, and I think CMHC came out with a report about this recently, but those delays kind of are quite significant for affordability. They also got hit by the empty homes tax, which was interesting because they had kind of acquired these properties. They had given notice to the tenants in these houses. And because they had not actually started construction, they were hit with a tax. Luckily, they were able to fight it. But it was another thing kind of that they had to deal with. And it could have easily kind of killed the project financially. So thinking about kind of some of the progressive policies for the city of Vancouver, they agreed to kind of reduce the parking spaces because the group was planning to do kind of an internal car sharing system. So they were saying, we don't all need to have a car. We're going to be sharing vehicles, which is what they're doing now. And that created that music room and workshop space. They were also able to create these larger bike rooms that they wanted in order to store cargo bikes. That is, like, there are not a lot of buildings where there is actually room to store those cargo bikes. So that was something that was really important to people. other policies that could have really benefited this project. So the city didn't really think of the social nooks and the exterior walkways as social amenity spaces, which they really are so important for social interaction. So if that had been the case, and they could have counted them as they could have actually had more density on the site if they had excluded those spaces. So it is something to think about in your kind of definition of what is an amenity space. Often it is, a room with 4 walls or, an outdoor space. But these kind of like smaller scale spaces can actually be really impactful for social connection. And we did do that with the City of Port Moody guidelines. So there are exemptions for kind of social nooks in buildings. The other thing that I know is a hot topic right now is single stair egress design. So that would have actually saved a lot of money on this project. They kind of have a single stair configuration basically, but then they had to add a second exit stair with their kind of like lobby nook. So if that would have been allowed, it would have actually changed the project quite a bit. And then thinking about the mix of formal and informal common spaces, that small lobby is actually really impactful. And again, you'll see that like none of these spaces are like luxuriously finished. They're pretty simple, but they're really well located and really well thought out. And these kind of social nooks are really, really awesome. Every time I go to the building, I'm just so impressed with them. So it really feels like quite different than when you're, walking in a typical 6-story building where you're walking through that double loaded corridor, the long double loaded corridor. This really feels like kind of an extension of people's homes. They keep their shoes out there. There's like kids reading there every day after school. They've got kind of the natural light and those like the connection to the exterior circulation. So they're really, really effective spaces, and they're not really big spaces, right? Like they didn't need to add a ton of area to the building to make them happen. It was really about the intentional design. And then I think it's like going back to the way that they actually use their social spaces. They're kind of constantly reinventing how these spaces are used. So this is the common house during craft. There's people like working, there's people doing crafts. They use these for all kinds of types of activities. They have their little rumpus room. They also keep exercise equipment in the laundry room so that they can use it in that room. They have a folding work desk. They're using that music room also for like a teen hangout space. They've got, sleepovers and yoga on that 6th floor flexible roof. So they're really like maximizing how they use their spaces. And it was interesting. They had kind of like a Halloween party last year, and they invited all the neighbors to come in and kind of come into their building. And a lot of the buildings around there are very similar in terms of design and what types of amenity spaces. And the other neighbors were just like so inspired with how they actually use their spaces that it has actually changed how they use the spaces in their buildings. So one of the buildings also has a kids playroom and rumpus room now that they've converted. So it's often like sparking the idea of people to say like, hey, we actually have these spaces in our building, but we don't actually use them. And it just takes kind of sometimes one person to change that. Okay, so then thinking about kind of the social benefits, we talked to a lot of residents, especially beneficial for people who are living alone, older adults and families. There are a lot of people who age in place in co-housing, and they live in these communities for a very long time because they they have the support from their neighbors to check in on them, to help them with medical appointments. And people really say that it is about like, it really takes away the effort of socializing. So those small everyday moments of social connection are really important, and it feels very low stakes for them to have those connections. So the common meals are kind of a central part of that. And they just have that feeling of security that network is there for them when they need it. Lots of like financial benefits as well for people. So they're sharing food, sharing the common meals. People report, eating out a lot less. They have a before and after school group care. So a lot of the seniors are playing this role. They're walking the kids to and from school while the parents are at work. I've got teenagers helping with childcare for some of the younger kids, car sharing, and then just combining, resources. So, not everyone needs to own a blender because they can use the blender in the common house. They have one lawnmower, so it's just like reducing what they need to buy and kind of their consumption of things. And then finally thinking about how can we make these co-housing projects easier to build. So as I said, only 20 to 30% of them are actually successful. So that's not a really great success rate. There was just one in Vancouver that folded after several years, and they just weren't able to to close on a piece of land that they wanted. Some of the kind of key challenges that we've seen is project timelines. So because approvals take so long, it's a pretty onerous commitment for people to be like, I'm gonna, take this process that's going to take 6 years or 7 years to get a new home. And a lot of things can change in your kind of life needs as you kind of commit to that. The financial and legal models. So we're starting to work with this with some of our partners and thinking about how we're actually funding this. And if any of you heard from Ryan from Men's City, who was in the financing section, he was starting to talk about some of the programs that they're developing, particularly for kind of multiplexes. But co-housing really remains unattainable and unaffordable for most right now. Defining common spaces, I think this is a policy piece that we can really work on, which is like recognizing that these kind of functional and circulation spaces are crucial for social connection, and the way that we talk about them in our policies can make a big difference. And then, we're just trying to share stories of these kind of co-housing communities. Many don't understand, what co-housing actually is. It's not a commune. It's, people are owning, their own condo, and also kind of trying to highlight these social benefits. It is kind of an answer to our aging population and to our loneliness and social isolation crisis. And it is kind of one of those housing models that we would like to see more of as an alternative for people who are interested. And then the other piece is that we're really trying to learn from these communities because they do so many interesting things with their common spaces and their programming. So how can we, take lessons from co-housing and apply it to rental housing or strata housing that is already out there.